And before I begin with the presentation, if you wouldn't mind popping in the chat or speaking up, what do you know plot to be? Even if it's just in one or two words, what does a plot mean to you, or what comprises a plot?
Okay, so I would say the plot of a story is everything that happens in the story and the events surrounding the characters in the story.
Yes, that's very good. I like that it's the events surrounding the characters in the story that makes it a very encompassing definition. Thank you. Khoitimang, I see your hand is up.
I would say that the plot would be like, it tells us how, it carries out the fate of the characters, like how their lives will be, how they will change, or how they won't change, or maybe the environment around it will, because that's the thing. What's that thing? Static and round characters. I think that's the right term. But yeah, it's just like how things in general will change, even if it's not too much about the characters.
Yes, I like that you've picked up on an important point, which is change. There's always a cause and effect within plot. So thank you for picking that up. Can everyone see the screen I'm sharing?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. So I won't be able to see if your hand is raised. So if one of the comm members could just help me with that, but I will be able to see the chat. Are there any other comments on what a plot is, or what you think a plot is? Or why it is so necessary to know your plot? It's okay if you don't know, because that's the point of this session. So basically, for this session, we're going to talk about all the elements of plot to discover a pathway for your story. So I hope you have pen and paper ready, or your laptop ready to take notes, or if you're just going to sit back and soak it all in, please feel free to raise your hand or make a comment throughout the session as well. So let's begin. So what is a plot? A plot is a sequence of events that take place over the course of a story, and they're connected by the cause-effect principle. So that's if A happens, B will happen. So if you dislodge this rock, it will come tumbling down the mountain and possibly crush your character. So it's your choice to dislodge that rock. So that's where your power lies as a writer, is to create the causes and then figure out what the effects are. Because there could be multiple effects that are zooming around in your brain, and you could choose one or multiple to show how this event caused all of these next events to happen. Another interesting thing about plot is it could be linear or non-linear and have a mixed sequence. So linear just means it happens very normally, very naturally. Think about your Once Upon a Time stories, where everything happens very quickly and naturally. You're introduced to the main characters. The main characters encounter a problem, or they have to overcome a quest, and then there's a resolution. It's A, B, C. There's no jumbling about of times or events or past, present, future. It's all just happening in the present at once. But it could be mixed. It could go from backwards to forwards, and we'll take a deeper look into those later on in the presentation. The main points of a plot is that they consist of rising action, a climax, and a resolution. So that's where the interest lies, is creating these tensions, creating reader interest with the climax, and then leaving them with something, a question, a hope, suspense within the resolution. So those are the main subjects that make up a plot. And if we take a deeper dive into the elements of a strong plot, this is taken from the 7-step Protag's story construction. structure. So we're going to go through all of them, and feel free to chime in if you have any questions or problems. So the first one is exposition. And this is where you set out the scene and introduce the characters. Would someone like to suggest a book, a story, or a movie that we could use to unpack all of these to use as an example? Hopefully something that's like pretty popular so everyone can relate. Okay, I'm going to choose then, and I'm going to choose the old favorite, which is going to be Harry Potter, because I'm sure everyone has encountered Harry Potter and it's become a big nerddom fandom type of book that we encounter, but you can use other stories such as Star Wars, Cinderella, any of those. But for the sake of argument and to help everyone understand, let's use Harry Potter. So exposition for that one would be, we are introduced to Harry as the boy who lived, and what does this mean? And later on, we're introduced to his two best friends, Ron and Hermione. Then there's the inciting incident. These are problems, tensions, obstacles that are introduced or hinted at, and a chain reaction is started. So again, with Harry Potter, we are introduced to this idea of Voldemort as the person who must not be named. And we're like, ooh, what could this be? That doesn't sound very good, as well as the, not problem necessarily, but the power that he is a wizard. And what does that mean? What does that hold for the future of this character? Then there's the rising action. The story builds and the character embarks on solving, overcoming, or achieving something. So this is where a goal is almost set to where the story is going within your plot. So again, for Harry Potter, it would be that he has to figure it out in the wizarding world, figure out his place, grow as a person, and ultimately defeat this evil wizard. But there's a lot of other rising action that's within there, such as his friendship tensions and Malfoy and struggling at school. So you can have multiple rising actions going on at the same time. Then there's the climax. The story reaches the highest point of tension between good and bad, others and self, light and dark. So it's usually a clash of opposites, or it could be a clash with the self, as I say, so an internal conflict. It doesn't always have to be external. So if we use Harry Potter again, that would be when he is ultimately fighting Voldemort and trying to beat him and win. And this can be seen throughout most of the books. Then there's falling action, which is the resulting effects of the climax, and there's a shift in the nature of the characters, the tone, mood, or achieving a realization within this falling action. So it's not yet a resolution, it's kind of just the come down after this big fight, this big battle, or this big tension, which was the climax. So again, with Harry Potter, it would be figuring out, what does this mean for the future of Harry Potter and his friends? Because there's always another book, and what is going to happen in that next place, as well as seeing where his relationships stand after going through this big struggle. Then there's a resolution. The problem is solved, or the goal is achieved, or not. Sometimes the problem isn't solved or achieved. And that's okay. That can add suspense if you want your plot to take over a series, or if you just want to leave it open-ended and for the reader to fill in the blanks, come up with their own story, or just end it as like a little tease. That can also be quite fun. So with Harry Potter, again, sometimes Voldemort isn't fully defeated and comes back. So in that way, the problem is not achieved, but ultimately he is, and that's the resolution. Then the denouement is the story ends happily, tragically, comically, and you have to think about the feeling, the message, or question you want to leave with the audience here. So this is almost the final few pages or final paragraph of your story, where you're almost reflecting on what just happened in the story and you're leaving the audience with something. So again, with Harry Potter, ultimately in the end, he's sending his kids off to school on the Hogwarts train, and it's a very moving moment of almost how it's a circular kind of story, and he's overcome all these battles and has gotten to a place of peace, something like that. But we can look at other examples where there is more of a somber ending, and that is also fine. It depends on the ultimate tone and where you want your story to go ultimately. And it can be interesting to end it tragically or thoughtfully or even comically. It depends on your style. So this is a question I leave open for the audience. What else is necessary for a solid plot? What could be shifted, removed? And you should always feel free to play around with the plot. Are there any comments or questions regarding this mind map?
I have a question. What happens when there is no resolution, or there is no ending? How can you build a plot around that? Or can you? Because I've just read The Sense of an Ending, and that doesn't really have an ending, ironically.
Yes, I think.
Yeah. So how do you build a plot around that?
I think it's always fun to play around with plot and to subvert the expectations of what a plot is, and that will make your story memorable and interesting. So having an abrupt ending or having a sentence trail off could be an interesting and moving way to end your story. So there aren't any rules in terms of plot, but this is what would traditionally make a strong plot. And then it's up to you if you want to follow it, if you want to change it, if you want to bring in your own things. So having an open ending or an unfinished ending, there probably will still be a plot beforehand, or parts of a plot, and that results in an open-ended ending. And it ultimately comes down to what you want it to be in the end. But arguably, no ending is an ending in itself because it's still an ending. So it becomes this whole meta thing, which is very interesting as well. So thanks for that question.
Cool, thanks.
Are there any other questions or comments? Cool. I hope this is all making sense, and I'm sure it's you may have encountered it before. So now we're going to get on to, I think, some examples. Yes. So these are examples of traditional plots. So ones that kind of have the same step-by-step basis that I just showed previously. So Romeo and Juliet, very simple plot in a way, because they also kind of just say the entire plot in the first introductory monologue. So you're introduced to the characters, there's tension, and then there's an ending. And that ending is very tragic, and there's kind of a philosophical reflection you're left with. Roald Dahl's Matilda, again, starts very traditionally, introducing a character and watching them grow up and encounter challenges such as difficult and nasty school teachers, as well as magic abilities, and how does that leave her at the end of the day. And there's a very happy ending, the traditional happy ending at that story. Young Blood is a very interesting book. It's very simple, and it holds all these elements of the plot as you follow a young man who slowly descends into a life of crime. And that one as well does not have a very happy ending. It has more of it's just kind of, this is the way life is type of ending. So almost an unending in a way. We spoke about Harry Potter. And then interestingly, a lot of the Grimm's fairy tales follow the traditional plot structure because most of the aims were to teach some meaning, some moral lesson. So they followed a very simple pattern of, here's the character, here's the protagonist, here's the antagonist, here's the climax, here's them overcoming it happily ever after. But arguably, in the traditional Grimm's fairy tales, there wasn't really a happy ending. They were just kind of not very good, happy stories. They were very violent and kind of sadistic, which is still interesting, but plots can be adapted, as we've seen. So the original Sleeping Beauty is nothing like the remake. And how have those plots been adjusted to cater to new audiences and how has it created new meaning? So think of those things when you look back and reflect on some examples of plot. Then another good example are murder mysteries as seen by Agatha Christie, because you need to explain all of the characters first so that people can get to know them and build their own suspicions and jot down notes on who they think it is. And then ultimately there's going to be a murder. And so you know what to expect, but it's still the fun tension of who could it be? What is this mystery? Can I solve it before the book tells me who does it? So it creates that good reader author interaction. And sometimes, so in that example, it's fine to sometimes be like, here's the character, here are all the characters, this is what makes them interesting. And then we get on with the story. So exposition in that way is fun and fine if it's going to ultimately lead to a creative output. But it can be a bit boring to be like, this is Mary. Mary likes chocolate. Like, it's not that interesting if there isn't going to be interesting tensions and climaxes to come. Does anyone have any other examples of good plots? And we're talking about traditional plots now. We'll get onto more strange plots just now.
Not really a question, but like, I mean, not really. I just mean, are we going to touch on maybe like, the whole writing technique of like show, don't tell? Because I feel like that's useful when it comes to writing plot, right?
Yes, show, don't tell is useful in all writing. So we're definitely going to get into that. That was some of the steps in the plot, because it was just describing characters and describing events. And then the other writing styles will definitely consist more of show, don't tell, because of the diverse styles of plot.
Two books that I think have really good plot lines.
Mm-hmm.
And they just flow very nicely, and they're paced very nicely, which is another question I wanted to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
How long should you spend on each of those 7 points? Like, how do you pace the plot so that it's you're not spending too long on the building up to the climax? But yeah, so the books that I read are by Erin Morgenstern,
Yes.
The Night Circus and The Starless Sea, which are both amazing, and you should all read them.
Yes, the Night
I
Circus
think it's very good. I really enjoyed that build up to a climax, and it feels explained properly, and I know what's happening, but it also doesn't feel like it's dragging on for too long.
I think pacing is a good point. It is a difficult problem, because it again depends who you're writing for your audience, what medium, as it were, or what genre you are writing, and the purpose. So those three things affect the pace. Because if we think of the fairy tales are very, very short. They're maybe like 5 pages long. The play in comparison is longer, but not as long as Harry Potter, which stretches over a whole series. So if you are conceiving of a series, make sure you have all of those elements in each book, but across the whole series, they are there in a more zoomed out way. If you're writing a short story, you would want everything to be more condensed. So you would want to have, you want to dedicate enough time to each aspect without droning on. So you simplify it. Instead of having multiple rising actions, you have one. Instead of having multiple climaxes, you have one. Instead of having a very complicated resolution or coming like climax or coming down from the climax, you just go straight to the resolution. You don't have to have a falling action. You can skip some of the parts to make it more concise. Similarly, sometimes you don't need to start with exposition if you want to just get straight into it. You can just start with the climax or the rising action, because maybe you have a finite amount of space or time to get your story down, so you can cut out some of the elements to accommodate what you want to say. And hopefully through those climaxes and those rising actions, you are telling us about the characters through showing their actions within that battle, for example, or within that self-conflict. You're telling us who the characters are. So it's all about cutting and pasting elements of the plot steps to best suit your story. I know this is a very broad answer, but because plot is so malleable, I don't want to say this is a specific way to keep your pace tight or elongated and whatever. It depends on the audience. So again, like I said, and the genre. So audience again would be, are you writing for children? They don't want to read long, droning expositions. They want to get to who's who and the climax and the end. But if you're writing for an older audience, you can possibly have a more thought out plot that can span over a longer time, like the Orient Express, for example. So yeah, just keep, and then the message, like I said, if you want it to be philosophical, usually that's with the longer plot. If you want it to be happy, that's usually a shorter plot. I hope this helps. I know that was a bit of a ramble, but just think of those three things when you're considering your plot. Okay, so now we get onto the juicy stuff, which is non-linear plots that are diverse and they can shift and they do not follow that traditional pattern that we learned. So the point of me showing you the traditional pattern is you have to learn the basics in order to disrupt them. You can't just disrupt what you assume the basics are, because that's just like doing something that people won't really understand or see the significance of. Okay, so here's kind of like a word block of some good descriptions and definitions you should know. So when you start at the end, this is known as a frame story, and you make use of flashbacks and foreshadowing to harken back to the start of the story. So if you start at the end, for example, and it's like a character in the middle of a fight, and they've just been stabbed, for example, then you would jump back the audience to the front, to the beginning or the middle, and then perhaps have flashbacks harkening back to that moment of the battle. Then there's several seemingly unconnected narratives, which is called a hyperlink story, and they merge at the end, and there's a realization of an overarching theme. So this is when you're following multiple different characters or ideas even throughout a story, and you kind of don't know how they're all linked, and it seems a bit strange, but at the end, they all merge together. Then there's parallel narratives, which is kind of similar to a hyperlink story, but they don't link. That's why there's no link in them. So a tandem story, like a tandem bicycle, is where there's an A plot and a B plot, and narratives happen in the same universe, but they may not ever interact or come together or resolve. Or it could be something, so there could be two separate characters on a journey and they never intercept, or it could be the same character, but they have two plots that they're involved in. So they could be involved in a big family crisis in plot A, and then in plot B, they're involved in a big dance competition, for example, and that's the B plot. And there's different climaxes and rising actions in both of those, and they're happening at different times, or they're happening at the same time, and this makes things go a bit wild. Cool. Then there's double protagonist or multiple protagonist, or double antagonist, multiple antagonist, which follows many good people on their separate or intertwined journeys. So this is when you're following the stories of multiple different people on their journeys, and they each have their different expositions, resolutions, climaxes, all of that. And they can either be intertwined or separate, but the main focus is on the protagonist. So it could be told from their perspective. So for example, each chapter could have a different narrator, a different character. Okay, so I'm going to go over these tips and ideas, and then I'll give you some examples to flesh out these descriptions and definitions that I've given you. But as you can see, plot is very rich in its diversified nature. So, like I said, each chapter could be told from a different character's perspective, and they all intertwine at the end. For example, the book Let It Snow by John Green and all the other authors, because I think a different author wrote different chapters, and that's also interesting for authors to intertwine their jobs. Then a very common kind of genre is time traveling stories, where they make use of disrupting linear timelines by confusing past, present, future. Or there's a circular plot where the end is actually the beginning. So it all links together. Examples is The Time Traveler's Wife, and also Shutter Island, where in the end, it's almost going back to the beginning again, like pressing rewind and restart. So time traveling stories, you have to be very clear with when their timeline is, where they are, so that people don't get confused. So you can jump forwards or backwards in time through flash forwards or flashbacks. And this is usually told from a first person narration so that readers don't get confused. And this creates an interesting narrative device and gives the character more depth and insight because you can see inside their mind. So it's like saying, I remember when I was a child and I did hopscotch on the lawn every day. And that reminded me of when I met this girl, and then you're back in the future. So it's showing those different aspects of the self, and that can guide the plot forward by showing past, present, and future ideas. For example, the book A Fraction of the Whole, which is about a man in prison who is reflecting on his life, so you learn why he's in prison. And that's an interesting way, because an interesting way of building suspense. Then To the Lighthouse, which jumps crazily in time, where 10 years is condensed into like a chapter or 10 pages, and a day is stretched out into chapters and chapters. So again, pacing comes up there, and it all depends on what you want to show. What does that impact of time do for the characters as well as the reader? Then, like I said, you could start during the climax or in medias res, which just means in the middle of it all, to grab attention. So starting from the end can increase suspense for the beginning of the story, which we later run into. So you can start the story at any point, depending on what type of mood you want to build for the character. And for the audience and the genre, all of these things are intertwined. So plot is very malleable to your specific needs. So if you want to start in the middle of it all, it could be something ominous, like I'm standing at the edge of the cliff and I don't know what my next step will be. And then you can either carry on from there, or you can do flashbacks back in time. And that can make the reader want to continue more. So I'm going to hop along to the examples. I hope all of this is making sense. Feel free to chime in at any time. We do have about 3 minutes left of this Zoom call, so please just hop back on the link before, like after it runs out. So here are some examples. Does anyone want to talk about their own examples or draw on these examples?
Go ahead, Pratima.
Yeah, I was gonna say that like Julian mentioned the point about like a circular kind of plot where like the beginning is actually the end is actually the beginning or something. And then this just reminded me of like this animated film I watched where like the way the movie opened, it was that it was a funeral, and then I can't remember the details, but like it goes back onto just normal time, and then we see these two characters interact, and then like towards the end, it's kind of that thing where like we learn that like one character has an illness, and then it just starts to be implied that this character is expected to die. So then it's that thing where like towards the end, it's kind of this thing of like you start connecting the dots that the funeral that was shown in the very beginning was actually like a fast forward of the character's death, if that makes sense.
Yes, that's very interesting. I think that's a very ominous and suspenseful way to start, because you want to know who died and why, and because you start off not having any connection to the character and you end feeling very sad. So I think
And
that's
even like sorry.
no, carry on.
And even like the way it was like hinted that the character will die, it was like we didn't know how, because there was one way they would die, like from a sickness. That is what they knew. But then the way they died was like from a different cause. So then it actually sets the shock of like, so this is what happened to the character, and it was this character all along in a way.
Yes, so that's exactly what makes plots so interesting, and that's the whole thing of a plot twist, the very scary and interesting word that is plot twist. So thank you for that example. I think it's definitely spot on. And that's definitely what all good plots have, is a plot twist. And I hope that you're going to be able to incorporate some of those plot twists into your stories, whether that's changing the character who you think is supposed to die, or changing the linear narrative of the story. Then if we look at Pulp Fiction has multiple protagonists or antagonists, arguably, that we follow. They're almost anti-heroes, and their plots or narratives ultimately intertwine and they encounter each other. And it's very interesting how they do it, because you would not think that they would. They sometimes just randomly happen to encounter each other. And again, this Pulp Fiction begins in medias res, because it starts with a seemingly normal couple in a cafe, and then all of a sudden they pull out guns and they start a shoot up. So seemingly innocent, but not really beginning, and that shows how it's in medias res. If we look at Brokeback Mountain, I use this because it follows two separate protagonists that you follow them on their separate journeys once they've encountered each other, and how you can have multiple plots going on at the same time, and they each have their own lives, own rising actions and resolutions. And this one does not end very happily for one of them. Again, in Midsummer Night's Dream, there's multiple plots going on. There's an A plot and a B plot, and they do coincide in the end, and they end up disrupting each other's plots without actually knowing that they're doing it. So you as a reader, you're like, oh my gosh, that's so annoying. Why did that happen? Can't they just be so like aware of themselves? And that creates tension as well. Plots accidentally interrupting other plots. So whether that is, if it's a character who's riding on a bike and clips a person on the sidewalk, and now we're following this person on the sidewalk story. So it could also be used as a narrative device to shift perspectives. And that was also seen in To the Lighthouse. Wuthering Heights was interesting because one of the main protagonists, spoiler alert, dies in the middle of the book. So you can do that. You can disrupt what you think should happen at the end actually happens in the middle. And that shifts the whole narrative then of what is the climax? What is the resolution if this thing that should happen at the end has happened in the middle? Immigrants follows different stories of immigrants, I think from Germany, I'm not too sure. And I don't think their stories intersect, but you're following different people and different chapters are about different people. And in that way, you get invested separately in different people's lives. In The Road, we again encounter it in medias res, where the apocalypse has happened. We didn't experience the apocalypse, we just know that the apocalypse happened. And now we have to venture into the world afterwards. And what does that mean? And then Big Fish also uses a plot device of storytelling within a story to give insight into a person's history. And what's interesting in Big Fish is we question whether these stories are actually true. So things you tell us in the plot through flash forwards or dreams or premonitions may not be true. You can lie to the audience and then show through a different way how your character was actually lying. And that could be a very interesting way to create unreliable narrators or storytellers through the use of an unreliable plot, as it were. So yes, stories within stories is also a narrative device. So plots within plots, and that can give us insight into different characters, as well as the history or future of different characters. Does anyone else have any examples, questions, or plot twists especially that they would like to share? Because a lot of these have plot twists, but I'm keen to hear more. Even if
Hi, I have an
Mark.
sorry. Yeah, so there's this movie called The Prestige, and it follows two magicians who are sort of at each other's throats. And it actually deals with that whole idea that you're talking about, whereby, you know, you're sort of jumping between the future, the present and then the past, and then, you know, going back and forth all the time. So at some point, let's just say magician B gets imprisoned, and he's reading letters that magician A left behind. And these letters sort of detail how magician A managed to, you know, sort of figure out this great grand magic trick, right? And we also find out that magician A also got a hold of magician B's secrets, right? Like one of his notebooks, because he wanted to figure out how to do a magic trick. And then it kind of ties into what you mentioned about the big fish, whereby, you know, you kind of question the validity of, you know, the events that happen, because these two magicians know that they're reading each other's secrets. And so they even leave out details and, you know, sort of lead each other on. And so I just thought that was like quite interesting, and a very good example about, you know, jumping between different points in time, and even, you know, subverting our expectations by not making them reliable narrators of the story. Thank you.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. I agree. I love The Prestige. Very, very cool. Very trippy. And it does use narrative device of letters or of diaries and books. And I think that's a good plot device to use. Also, a question you may have, or a problem you may have encountered, is how do I differentiate the now from the past, or the now from the future, etc., to my readers? So you could either do this through like the beginning of a chapter, putting the date, like 1956, for example, or putting the name of the character that's narrating, like Michael George or whatever it is. Or alternatively, you could give the character a notable accessory or injury or animal even that's with them in a certain part of the timeline, but isn't with them in another part of the timeline. So like Mark was saying, the books and the notes, those only happen at a certain part in the timeline. Another example would be 13 Reasons Why. I don't really want to talk about it, but it is the best one I can think of at the moment, where the main character has a scar on his head in the current time, but in the past, there's no scar on his head. So in order for us to identify where we are and when we are within the plot, we look for those things. So perhaps give your character a dog that they have with them in the past, but maybe they don't have with them in the future. And we identify when we are by the character referring to the animal, for example, or referring to the notes, or referring to the injury. So that will help for you to have a clear timeline. Thank you for the comments in the chat that the plot twist of Heathcliff turning from victim to villain in Wuthering Heights. Yes, I agree. And arguably, it could be that Heathcliff turned from villain to victim as well. So perhaps because he lost someone, and we vaguely feel sorry for him despite his despicable attitude and things. Are there any other remarks?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I just wanted to mention the woman in the window, and also I think A Girl on the Train or The Girl on the Train. I think those two are really good examples of plot twists, but that also incorporate unreliable narrators. And I think that's like a really good combination because when you read a book or even watch a movie from one single like perspective, you usually think of it as being the true perspective or the correct perspective, I suppose. And then, you know, as the plot progresses, you slowly realize as the audience or as the reader that the narrator or the person's perspective that you've been seeing all this time is actually questionable and unreliable, and that creates a really nice like plot twist or events for plot twists.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. I think it also destabilizes you as a reader because you now think, why did I believe that? What can I believe? And I think that that's a very interesting position to put your audience in. Are there any other plot twists or interesting plots that you've encountered that don't follow the ABC steps, as it were? It's definitely done in a lot of movies. I think it's easier to illustrate visually, but it definitely can be done in books. It just takes a bit of finessing. So if we think of, for example, Shutter Island and Inception and all those movies, they definitely use they play around with that concept of time and reality. And that can definitely unhinge your story and disconcert your reader in a very good way. It's better to read an interesting and complicated plot than a boring and simple plot. Cool. If we don't have any more examples or any more comments, I'm going to move on. So now it's prompt time. So I thought we'd do something a little differently, just because I was hoping, and it's difficult to write a whole plot within 15 minutes. So I just suggest that you could either do a mind map, you could jot down some notes, or whatever works best for you to kind of sketch out a rough outline of a plot line using the tools we have discussed. Then if you have time and if you're feeling willing and able, you could write a part of the story out to illustrate the plot and narrative devices used. I hope that makes sense. So right now you can just jot down, I'm thinking of using a circular plot in this way, and this is what I ultimately want to happen. And you can just write it like a brief sketch, and then flesh out a part of that idea. Or if you have a story within your mind already, you can run with that, and you can just flesh out a part of that to illustrate plot. So here are some prompts. I woke up with a start. My dream was so unnerving. Once upon a time. The heat of summer reminds me of my childhood of running through sprinklers. Or you could write a story from the two perspectives of a person, one locked in a prison and the other is their warden. Or alternatively, starting medias res, Planet Roid splintered right before me. Goodbye home, I guess. I left the I out. But we move. Is everyone comfortable to get going on that? Any questions? You also can use your own story if you don't want to use one of the prompts. Cool. Well, let's get writing. I'll give us till about 8:05 and see how everyone's doing. All right, let's start finishing up that thought, concluding that sentence. Would anyone like to share with us their rough outline, their mind map, or even part of their story?
I have a.
Wait.
Oh, no, you go.
Okay. I haven't gotten so far with mine, but I chose the third prompt, the one about summer and childhood. And then I just wanted to change up like the vibe of it. Well, just like making it a bit dark. I don't know. I kind of like doing that.
Yeah.
So it basically has like, it starts as a flashback and then it kind of like shifts a bit to the present or just like between that, where the character is just like talking about their childhood, being chased, and then it's like since then or something, they've gotten better at like they've gotten into more trouble, and like obviously that got them better to like escaping situations and running. So then this kind of like shifts to like at their present time that involves like, how do I say this? Like at their present time, basically they are in some shady job. So it's that thing where like they do a lot of getting away with things.
Mm.
And then it's like, and then it's like going back to maybe linking their childhood a bit. It was this thing of like the people they've known from their childhood. It's like, yeah, it's like their childhood is something that they remember every once in a while. And it's like the people that they remember from there, it would be like dangerous for them if the person were to like come in contact ever again because of like their shady job or something. So then it's that thing where basically they have to move to they have to move to like out of the country, and then it's like those people that they remember from their childhood, because it was very long since they've seen them. Ever since they moved to the new country, they start getting like let's say they start seeing these familiar faces on the news as like missing or dead, as in it's like, and then like that's where I kind of stopped. But then I would continue and be like, maybe their occupation has like something to do with it. Like maybe they were being distracted the whole time, or like the kind of cliche where like people from their childhood, like maybe even family or just like someone they knew, had a link to the shady job. Like it's not something I had too much detail in, since like I just came up with it. But yeah,
It
as
sounds
if there would
very
be like
cool.
kind of plot twist.
Yes, I really like the dark spin you put on like a seemingly happy prompt. So that's very inventive. Well done. I also like the whole thing of connecting the childhood to almost explain or create suspense about the current character and their dodgy dealings. And I definitely think it holds a lot of potential. So you should definitely continue exploring it.
Yeah, like the concept actually seems interesting.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So keep going. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I don't know if I heard Dylan as well.
Yeah, I have more of a rough idea. It's not very fleshed out, but yeah, I just have like a few lines of ideas here. So basically, the plot line follows a person reading someone else's diary, but the diary is entirely about them as the person reading it, and us as the reader. Okay, yeah, so us as the reader, like the person reading the book, don't know that the narrator is reading someone else's diary. However, as the plot progresses, we get like a sense of something strange happening as the story gets slightly darker and more twisted. And we get the sense through breaks in character that happen at the end of each chapter, and these breaks in character get increasingly longer as the story goes on, and eventually there's the revelation that, you know, the narrator is reading a diary of someone else that's written entirely about them, and now they sort of have to deal with this. Yeah, like I don't know, maybe it's someone they know quite well. I haven't gotten to that point, but yeah, that's just an overarching idea that I've had.
That's really cool. So it's kind of like building the suspense of what is real and what is someone else's life. Like, where's the distinguishing factors?
Yeah, something like that.
I think it's really cool. I think it's a good plot twist that what we're reading is we're also being like the voyeur. We're also the main character, experiencing this realization. I think that's really, really cool. I think it's going to be interesting the way you flesh out the character breaks, as you called it, or like the little slippages of, wait,
Yeah.
is this real or is this a diary? This feels very strange. I think that's going to be very interesting. Yeah, I think it's a
Cool.
really, really
Thanks.
cool idea. Does anyone else want to have a go?
Hi. I do have one, but it is a bit long, so I'll try and summarize it as best as I can. I chose the first, which was, I woke up with the start. My dream was so unnerving. So it starts off with that line, and then I'm kind of just like detailing how the plot will go down. So I'm not really like any dialogue or anything. So the main character proceeds to get ready for school. As they step outside, they witness a taxi hurtling down the street. Unfortunately, a cat bolts into the street to the surprise of the taxi driver and the passenger beside him. The taxi driver tries his best to avoid the car, but veers into a local pawn shop and kills the owner instantly. The main character is horrified as he was very close to the pawn shop owner. When authorities arrive, it turns out the taxi driver was drunk and continues rambling on about a passenger who disappeared. The main character processes his grief by going over the items he bought from the pawn shop and stumbled across a belt that could supposedly allow a person to time travel. He wears it and uses it to time travel to the day of the horrific accident. He ends up behind a Chinese restaurant, hits his head upon arrival, and falls unconscious. By the time he wakes up, he realizes that the accident will happen soon, and he won't have time to prevent it. As he scrambled to his feet, he disturbs a cat that was scrounging for food in a trash can. The main character has a bad back from his fall, but sets off on foot, and after half an hour of little progress, he decides to wait for a taxi. The taxi that arrives has a haggard alcoholic at its wheel. He speeds along to the destination, and when they're a block away, the main character pressures the driver to hurry up, and he drives more recklessly. By the time they're nearly at the pawn shop, they witness a cat abruptly cross the street to the surprise of the taxi driver and the main character. They veer off the road to avoid the cat and crash into the pawn shop. The impact causes the main character to lurch forward against the dashboard, which activates the time travel belt. And then it ends off with, I woke up with a start. My dream was so unnerving. So it's kind of like a cyclical.
Ooh, I see it. I see how everything's connected. That's so cool. That's a really cool idea. I think it could work well as like a short story. And then just leaving it kind of open-ended like that would be super, super cool. Because even now, you describing it was very visual and entertaining, but very like simple and elegant. So it could definitely work as a very minimal what's going on type of story. Where does it begin? Where does it end? I really like that. Well done. Are there any other people that would like to share or make comments? We do have 5 minutes left of this session, so I'd say we could maybe squeeze one more in before we sign off. Again, if you don't feel comfortable sharing here, you are welcome to email us with your story, your mind map, and we can definitely give you feedback or guidance, whatever you require. Okay, I don't think anyone else is going to share, but thank you all for those who did share. You had amazing ideas, and I really hope you continue and flesh them out as you go along. Thank you all for being here and for rejoining. Very tedious, I know, but I appreciate it, and I appreciate your interaction and your enthusiasm. If you haven't already yet, please sign up to Ink Society via the SRC Are You Connected page. Also follow us on all of our social medias. We have Instagram and Facebook, and we are now on YouTube, where you will be able to find the link for this recording. Keep your eye out for other emails updating you about what sessions we have next. But thank you so much for joining us, and I appreciate it. And I hope you go on your journey of creating plots and living out your own plot as creatively and excitingly as possible. So thank you, everyone.